Welcome to the Crash Training Podcast, where we're going to help you work to reclaim or preserve the highly perishable skill set of crash reconstruction. Welcome everybody to episode number 6, where we're going to look at the same scenario we had last week with that vehicle that skids across two surfaces and then goes airborne. But this time, unlike episode number 5, where we worked everything with the minimum speed equation and then used it and looked at it as a combined speed problem, in episode number 6, we're going to look at the same scenario and we're going to look at it as an energy problem. And I know there's a lot of hesitation usually with people once they go through their initial training and their initial levels of crash reconstruction. A lot of times, energy is one of those things that doesn't get focused on a whole lot. And once you get to the field or once you start working cases, it's one of those things to where you're not really comfortable with it because you didn't have a whole lot of practice with it. And you've got huge numbers, we're talking about like 200,000 and 300,000 foot-pounds of energy. And that can be a little intimidating sometimes, especially if you're not really familiar with the formulas or how to get what you're getting. So in my opinion, what we're about to do in episode number 6 is a whole heck of a lot easier than what we did in episode number 5. I think it is much easier to do this as an energy problem as opposed to a combined speed problem. So let's look at the same car. Again, he's going to slide out to a stop, and this time we want to focus on this from an energy perspective. And my car is going to go 75 feet on a drag factor of 0.72, and this time I want to know what the speed is at the start of the skid, just like always, and I also want to know what the kinetic energy is. All right. We're going to say that our guy still comes in at 0 miles per hour, but this time we're going to look at it from an energy perspective. Now, if you remember back in episode number 4, we kind of looked at the minimum speed equation and energy kind of, an apples to apples comparison for one surface. So I know that if I want to work this as an energy problem, to calculate the kinetic energy that was used to slide these 75 feet on this 0.72 drag factor, I just say that kinetic energy is equal to the drag factor times the weight of the vehicle times the distance of the skid. Now, the only variable that we haven't had to use yet for this multi-surface into the airborne is weight. So we're going to go ahead and assign the weight right now. We're going to say that this vehicle weighs a total, with the occupants, cargo, and everything, of 3,475 pounds. So now we have everything we need to use this equation. We've got the drag factor, because it's still 0.72. I just assigned the weight. We're going to say that it's 3,475 pounds. And I can go out to the scene and I can measure the distance of those skids like any other wreck, and I've got 75 feet. Now, this is going to give me an answer in foot-pounds. All right. Now, to figure out what the speed is, I've got to take it a step further, and I've got to say that the speed is equal to the square root of kinetic energy multiplied by the number 30 divided by the weight of the bullet vehicle. And that's the vehicle that brought the energy into the party. So we always want to use the weight of whatever car is doing the work. So in this case, he slid those 75 feet. It was a 3,475 pound vehicle. So I'm going to use those 3,475 pounds for the weight to convert this from an energy into a speed. And we know that if it's one surface, that the minimum speed equation and working energy would give me the same answer. Because he had that energy loss. He went from his total amount of energy, and he used all of his energy doing the work to come to a stop, and he ends at 0 miles per hour, and he also ends at 0 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. So as long as it's one surface and comes to a stop, or starts from a stop, as long as they're going to or from a stop, minimum speed and energy is going to be exactly the same. And also, you remember from last week, we know that our vehicle is not going to just come to a stop on this one surface. He's going to continue on, and he's going to go airborne after he slides over a second surface. So we're going to say that he slides those 75 feet with that 0.72 drag factor, and then he slides those 25 feet with that 0.45 drag factor, and then he's still going to go airborne at 40 miles per hour. We're not going to change anything. We're going to do the exact same problem. We're just going to look at it from an energy perspective now. So what I'm going to do in a nutshell is, the great thing about energy is I don't have to combine anything. With using this with energy equivalent speeds, I have to combine those speeds at the end. I can't just simply add the speeds together. But with kinetic energy, you can kind of think of this as like, you go shopping. If you want to know how much money you spent, you could just add up all your receipts, and that would be the total money that you went in the store with, or the total money that you spent on your shopping trip. Kinetic energy is exactly the same way. I can simply add these energies together, just like if I went to a store, or 3 or 4 stores, and I had receipts from everywhere I went. You can kind of think of these two surfaces and that airborne as 3 different receipts. So our first energy we want to account for is up here on surface 1, where he goes to 75 feet and the 0.72 drag factor. Our second receipt is going to be where he goes 25 feet with a 0.45 drag factor. Our third receipt is going to be the energy that he had left over when he went airborne at 40 miles per hour. And to figure out how fast he was going here, I'm just going to add up my receipts. All right, and we'll do all that here in just a second. But I'm just going to add up my receipts. I'm going to say, receipt 1 plus receipt 2 plus receipt 3 is going to give me the kinetic energy at the start of the skid. And then I can convert that to a speed. So it's going to be very simple once we look at this. All right, so let's go to our little virtual whiteboard here, and let's work through the problem. All right. We had surface 1, and we want to figure out what his kinetic energy is. And we have the drag factor multiplied by the weight multiplied by the distance. So KE is equal to that 0.72 drag factor multiplied by the weight of the vehicle of 3475. Multiplied by the distance of the slide, which was 75 feet. I multiply all 3 of those things together, and I've got a kinetic energy on the first surface of 187,650 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. All right, so for surface number 2, I'm just going to come over here. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say kinetic energy is equal to the drag factor multiplied by the weight of the vehicle multiplied by the distance again. So kinetic energy is equal to, this time we've got a lower drag factor. We've got a 0.45. We've got the same 3,475 pound vehicle, but this time we only have a skid distance of 25 feet. So I multiply all 3 of those together, and now I've got a kinetic energy of 39,093 foot-pounds. All right, so I'm starting to figure out how much I spent at each store. At the first store, I spent 187,650 foot-pounds. All right. At the second store, I spent 39,093 foot-pounds. Now, for this third store, I don't have a drag factor and a weight and a distance. I know that his speed when he went airborne was 40 miles an hour. So if I know the speed of the vehicle and the weight of the vehicle, I can figure out how much kinetic energy that vehicle possessed at the point that he went airborne at those 40 miles an hour. So I don't need the drag factor and the distance. I just need to know the speed and the weight of the vehicle. I've got the weight and I've got the speed. So once you calculate that speed with things like, airbornes, or, maybe even a crush or something like that, if they hit a tree or a pole, once we figure out that kinetic energy, or that speed rather, we can use that to figure out the kinetic energy. So to do that, I'm going to say that kinetic energy, this time is equal to the weight of the vehicle multiplied by the speed squared divided by 30. All right, 30 is still a common theme. So we're going to say kinetic energy is equal to 3475 multiplied by 40 squared divided by 30. So the kinetic energy is equal to 3475 times 1600 divided by 30. I'm going to continue here. And I'm going to say that kinetic energy is equal to, once we multiply 3475 by 1600, we're going to have 5560000 divided by 30. And once we divide that number by 30, we're going to have a kinetic energy value of 185,333 foot-pounds. So now I've figured out how much I spent at all three stores. So I can go, back to my diagram. Especially when you're working anything, even if we're doing this with minimum speed, it is so much easier to keep track of everything in this type of format. Draw everything out, make little diagrams, pictures, do your math right under the skids that you've drawn in even, and it makes life a whole lot easier. So now I'm going to start filling in the blanks. I'm going to say at surface 1, my kinetic energy is 187,650. All right, surface number 2, my kinetic energy is 39,093 foot-pounds, and then at number 3 at airborne, my kinetic energy was 185,333. So now I can just add these up. I can add surface 1 plus surface 2 plus surface 3, and then I can figure out what the total amount of energy is at the start of that skid. All right, so I'm just going to say kinetic energy total is equal to kinetic energy 1 plus kinetic energy 2 plus kinetic energy at airborne. So we're at 187,650 plus 39,093 plus 185,333. We add all three of these up together, and the total kinetic energy that we have for this entire system hold on one second. We're having a little bit of a technical difficulty with the pen here. Oh, okay, and we're back. Total kinetic energy for the entire system is going to be 412,076 foot-pounds. All right, so now that I know what the total energy is at the start of the skid, I can use that to figure out what the speed is at the start of the skid, just like when we did in episode number 4 with just one surface. So we're going to say speed is equal to the square root of kinetic energy times 30 divided by the weight of the vehicle. So speed is equal to the square root of 412.76 times 30 divided by 3475. All right, if you multiply your energy by 30, when we've got almost 500,000 foot-pounds of energy, that's going to be a really long top line. So to save time here, just on the podcast, I went ahead and divided it by 3475, and that's going to give us 3557.49 under the radical, and we take the square root of that, and we are at 59.64 miles an hour. With minimum speed, we were at 59.63. And that's probably just the way, if I had took the time and actually wrote this top line out and then divided it, and had everything truncated the way I normally would, I would be willing to bet I'd be at 59.63 miles per hour, just like with combined speed. But at the end of the day, 59.63 and 59.64, those are like really, really close to each other. I don't think we have to worry about that too much. So now I can look back at my diagram, and I know everything I need to know about this crash. I know that the driver came in at the start of the skid, with 412,076 foot-pounds of energy, or a speed of 59.64 miles per hour. And just like let's say if I wanted to know what his speed was right here. All right. So if, you wanted to know what the speed was here, all you would have to do now, if this is section 1, and this is section 2, and this is section 3, all you would do is you would do the exact same thing. You would just say that the kinetic energy was only equal to kinetic energy 2 plus your kinetic energy at airborne. And then you would just do that same equation to convert it to the speed, and you're going to get the answer for number 2. So in my opinion, I think this is a whole heck of a lot easier to do than those combined speed problems. If you'd like combined speed and you want to continue to do it that way, that's fine. Nobody's telling you you're wrong, because as you can see, everybody's going to be pretty close to the same numbers. It's more of a personal preference thing, but I think that kinetic energy is a little bit easier. Plus, I can it's easier to explain. Think about it. We have reconstructionists, law enforcement officers, even private consultants and reconstructionists probably. But we have people that are reconstructionists that do this kind of work, go out to the scenes, collect the evidence, do the calculations, and they still get tripped up on speed equivalencies. So if somebody that's had the training, because I know where I'm at, you go through about 6 to 8 weeks of training before you even get to the point to where you can really start to not run, but kind of fast walk on your own. All right, you've got that much training before you're even starting to get into a groove. So if someone with 6 to 8 or more weeks of training still gets held up or gets caught up on those speed equivalencies, what do you think it's going to do to a juror? So that's another reason you may want to consider doing kinetic energy as opposed to combined speed. It is extremely easy for me to look at this and tell somebody, say, hey, car came in at 59.64 miles an hour, and he had 412,076 foot-pounds of energy. He slid for 75 feet, and, that took up 187,650 foot-pounds of energy. He used that in the slide, and then he continued sliding for 25 more feet, and he used up 39,093 foot-pounds, but he didn't get rid of all of his energy because he had 412,000 foot-pounds. So he still had 185,000 foot-pounds, or whatever it was, once he went airborne at 40 miles per hour. And he had a speed change from the start of the skid to airborne of 19 miles an hour, roughly. That's a lot easier for people to see. That's a lot easier for people to understand, especially if you're dealing, with jurors and things like that. So that just may be something you want to, food for thought that you can consider if you're doing a lot of problems like these. You may want to look at kinetic energy as opposed to those combined speeds. All right, that wraps us up for episode number 6, energies added, not combined. And next time, we're going to start looking, we're still going to spend about 2 more episodes maybe, I forget, on the minimum speed equation. But next week, we're going to start looking at those variables, the distance and drag factor. We're going to look at those a little bit closer, and we're also going to look and see, how sensitive they actually are to changes, whether it's the drag factor, whether it's the distance that you measured. exactly how big of a difference does that make across the length of your skid? We're going to look at that in episode number 7 coming up here next week. In the meantime, remember, if you're watching this on YouTube, or especially, if you're doing this on the audio versions, the audio formats, go to crashtrainingsolutions.com/podcast, crashtrainingsolutions.com/podcast, and you can download all the visuals, slides, and math and everything from this episode of the Crash Training Podcast. So until next time, I am your host, Bobby J. Mullinax. I think I forgot to mention that at the beginning, but we're at the end now, so I'll tell you on the way out instead of on the way in. So if you've liked it, hey, leave us a comment, leave us a thumbs up on YouTube. Give us a notification, or turn notifications on. That way you'll know every time a new episode of the podcast drops. If you're listening to us on like Apple Podcast or Spotify or whatever, hey, give us a rating on there as well if you don't mind. And that way more and more people will start to see the podcast show up, and, it can be even more successful. So again, also remember, if you have any questions at all about especially anything that goes on in those first few phases of collision reconstruction, drop us a question. Go to the podcast website, which again is crashtrainingsolutions.com/podcast, crashtrainingsolutions.com/podcast. Toward the bottom of the screen, just scroll down and you're going to see how you can submit a question. You don't have to identify yourself. You don't have to leave an email or anything. If you want to leave an email, you can. And that way we can kind of email you and let you know when your question is going to be answered on the podcast. But you don't have to leave an email. That's optional. It's not going to require you to. It's not going to require anything other than you to input your question for the podcast. So if you've ever had something that maybe you forgot about, you were a little fuzzy on, you didn't quite understand, and now you're a little, you don't want to ask anymore because, maybe you've been out of recon training for a little while now or something, hey, drop it to us on the podcast. If you've got the question, other people do too. So until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you on the next one.